I am honored to stand before you today and begin my 4th year as your governor.
Hi, I'm Ben Felder with The Oklahoman, joined with The Oklahoman's lead Capitol reporter, Carmen Foreman. And Carmen, we just got done hearing Governor Kevin Stitt's 4th annual State of the State address. I timed it at 43 minutes, 4 seconds. Not sure how that compares to other years without looking it up. But a long speech is, it's often his biggest speech of the year, his biggest audience. A lot to unpack in this address. But what were some of your main takeaways from what you heard today?
Yeah, main takeaways I would say are, he's still got a big focus on the McGirt ruling. He's still criticizing the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in McGirt v. Oklahoma.
Oklahoma has been robbed of the authority to prosecute crimes. Put simply, McGirt jeopardizes justice.
Although the tribes have said, now's the time for the governor to come to the table and let's have a show of unity.
Recently, we've won 2 major victories to protect law and order. First, the Supreme Court agreed McGirt is not retroactive. That means that convicted criminals stay in prison. The Supreme Court also agreed to hear another case. A win in that case would let the state go back to enforcing law and order and protecting more crime victims in eastern Oklahoma.
And then I'd also say that education was a big topic for the governor. He wants to support an expansion of school vouchers. He also talked about, giving some sort of performance-based pay incentives to teachers, although I didn't hear any details on that, did you?
Details on how he's going to get to that number. And he said that he would sign any legislation that expanded school choice or parent school choice, which is kind of reminiscent of when he first came into office saying, I'm going to sign any legislation that restricts abortion further.
We know education is not a one-size-fits-all. And I pledge to support any legislation that gives parents more school choice. Another roadblock in our current systems keeps some of the best teachers out of the classroom. Right now, some talented teachers choose to leave the classroom to make more money as an administrator. Oklahoma students can't be the best without the best teachers. That's why I'm proposing matching funds so that our best teachers can make 6-figure salaries and stay in the classroom. It's the right thing to do for our teachers and for our kids.
We're happy that the governor is now on board with paying teachers more money. It's nice after a decade of insisting that is something that we should be doing in our state, that we have the governor looking at that. But devil's in the details. So we're just going to have to see exactly what that looks like.
McGirt and education were 2 things we heard about. One thing we didn't hear about was COVID. No direct mention of COVID. More than 13,000 Oklahomans have died of the pandemic. He did mention it in last year's speech. In fact, took some time to honor those that had died, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly.
I feel like that was at the front of his speech, at the very beginning.
But for him, and to be fair, most of the Republican legislature, the pandemic is in the past for the most part. He praised the state remaining open and his policies compared to other states, but we didn't hear him talk about the pandemic at all.
When he gave his State of the State in 2021, he talked about 3,000 people who had died in Oklahoma because of the coronavirus pandemic. There have been over 10,000 additional deaths since that point, but we heard no mention of that in today's speech.
One of the biggest, at least to me, one of the lines that stuck with me the most is he says there's never been a bigger difference between red states than blue states. He's probably right, but the fact that he said it, struck me because when he first ran for office, he kind of ran, granted, he was very conservative, but he kind of ran as an outsider, and he ran as someone whose chief political opponent was the system itself. I mean, he was running against Republicans, he was running to change government. He didn't talk in a lot of partisan language, but boy did he ever today, not just with that line, but talking about, attacks from the Biden administration, going after liberal teachers unions. I mean, this was a guy that was saying we are a deeply Republican state that, in his opinion, makes us better than the blue states, and I want to defend that.
Yeah, he definitely came in giving a vibe of very apolitical, where he tried to paint himself as apolitical. And what we saw today is, I think, a governor entering the re-election cycle and having to try to get every vote he can before November.
Yeah, and his chief opponent, State Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister, who had been a Republican, switched to the Democratic Party, is running more as a moderate. But I have a feeling that Stitt's saying, no, you got to pick a lane. You can't just pick the middle there. And he definitely picked a lane with conservative policies.
There has never been a bigger difference between a red state and a blue state. Freedom-loving Americans cannot escape liberal lockdown states fast enough. Our national economy is struggling. Inflation is at a 40-year high. gas and groceries are more expensive. Supply chain issues have made everything harder to find. But if you live in Oklahoma, it's a different story.
Carmen, finally, I watched the speech in the press room. You were in the gallery, a new position in the gallery after the renovations. It's always interesting just kind of the vibe inside there. I mean, of course, a supermajority of Republicans, so he got a lot of applause. The audience is full. I'm just kind of curious, what sights and sounds, kind of stood out to you during today's address?
Yeah, it's interesting. There were a couple of almost disruptions. I mean, there was a woman who had a big red banner and she tried to unfurl it at the back of the House chamber. So essentially, all the lawmakers facing Stitt wouldn't have seen it, but the governor, it would have been right in his eye line. There have been anti-abortion protesters in the Capitol today. I don't know if she's with them. I don't know if, it was somebody who's upset perhaps about his McGirt rhetoric. I don't know. It is always interesting when he recognizes people in the audience and asks them to stand. I thought it was really interesting that when he was talking about McGirt, he recognized this woman who lost her son to a drunk driver. I think this was in 2013, and he tried to use this as an example of the people who have been hurt by the McGirt ruling, and so he asked this mother to stand.
Pamela, I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm fighting for justice for Billy every single day. Will you please stand?
Yeah, an interesting way to get a round of applause from everybody, because you're right, the legislature is kind of divided. The tribes have a lot of support in the legislature, even in the Republican caucus. It's always interesting to see kind of the pomp and circumstance inside the chamber. You talk about protest. I know some people arrived at the Capitol this morning. There were protest signs against the governor on the oil derricks out there. So this is always a day that gets a lot of attention. And we know you're here covering the thick of it. You've got a lead story in tomorrow's paper. We'll be online today. I'm going to be covering kind of from an election angle, and we'll have more coverage from the governor's State of the State and the session the rest of the way through from the Oklahoma. With Carmen, I'm Ben. Thanks.